Firstly, we have 4 brief housekeeping rules. Firstly, if you have a mobile, please switch it off. Secondly, if you need to use the toilets, they're either side of the entrance. Thirdly, no fire alarm is planned today, so if you hear one, it's the real thing. We go down the ramp and meet outside the cathedral. And thirdly, obviously, if you wish, you can remove your mask here in the chamber, but please put it on again if you're going through a communal area. Can I finally, under this section, welcome actually Claudette Campbell-Clark back. Claudette's been back for a time in the council house, but it's the first time she's been here at this committee, so welcome, Claudette. For members who may not be familiar with Claudette, you need to do partial behaviour. I'll try to do my best. Item 2, apologies for absence, Claudette.
Chair, thank you. I have Councillor Marley Bennett replacing Councillor Paul Goggin today, and Councillor Chris Jackson is here replacing Councillor Steve Pearce. Those are the only apologies, and I think we're quorum now.
Thank you, Claudette. Can I welcome the subs, and particularly Councillor Bennett? I believe it's the first time you've been on DC, so welcome. A word of friendly advice. The chairman's a bit of a tartar here, so he likes officers and members to keep their comments short and sweet, but... declarations of interest. Are there any declarations? No. For minutes of the last meeting, can I have a proposer? Thank you, Philippa. And a seconder, V, thanks. I'll sign those. Thanks. Although there isn't a separate item, we've actually put on an action list of matters arising. So you'll see that in your papers. Gary Collins is going to briefly speak to that. Gary, could you do that in reverse order? Firstly, about the enforcement training.
Yes, thank you, Chair. So we had been looking to arrange this for some time and having to fit it in with the fortnightly briefings I think you get on a variety of things. So this was kind of in the forward plan for that, and so it was fixed for last Wednesday, and I'd notified all members of the DC committee that it was taking place then, so hopefully people who wanted to attend were able to attend. But if any members of the committee did want a separate briefing on enforcement or any other members, then we'd be happy to do that.
Thanks. And could you address yourself to the other item about plot 3, Bedminster Green, please?
Yes, thank you, Chair. This is a situation where, of course, the committee resolved to grant permission for the development on plot 3 in accordance with a Section 106 agreement that secured a number of measures, but including kind of parking measures within the local area. And obviously the committee have followed up with that in asking for speedy progress with that. And I know questions have been asked about that elsewhere. So the written response that I provided last time around is consistent with that approach. And so today I have no further update on that, because we're in a situation where, of course, as a regulatory non-exec committee, you're making decisions on planning applications and resolving what the contents of a Section 106 agreement should be and what they should secure. So that's happened. So in plot 3, any day now, the Section 106 agreement will be completed, and that will secure funding for a number of things, including parking measures in the locality. Then the implementation of such measures is then the responsibility of the council's executive to kind of carry out, really. So all I can say, Chair, is that we've concluded the 106 agreement in accordance with the resolution, but the actual implementation of it is a matter that would need to be taken up with the council's executive going forward.
Thank you, Gary. I'm not going to allow debate on this item, but can I invite Councillor Powden, who's a ward councillor affected, to briefly respond?
Thank you, Chair. Our duty as a planning committee is to make sure that the planning policies of the council are upheld. Every low parking developments are to be welcomed, but the way in which we make sure that policy is upheld is by making sure that people can't get residence parking zones, or in this case, actually putting in Section 106 requests to get some parking controls in the local area. I found the Mayor's response last time, as I mentioned, rather disappointing because it mentions nothing to do with parking controls, just livable neighbourhoods, which in and of themselves will not stop people parking close to their home on the local streets, and therefore we are not upholding, as a committee, the policy of this council. A week later, to be told that the livable neighbourhood strategy is no longer being taken on, I feel, is a dereliction of duty. And I really mean that this time. It's a quote we've heard before in planning, but I think it's actually a dereliction of duty because we're not upholding our policies. It seems that every time we try and do something strong leadership, we keep hearing about at the moment, but we're not seeing strong leadership on transport. We're seeing really whatever blah, blah, blah seems to be appropriate at the moment. And what we really want to see is a bit more action, and when residents who are concerned about this want to see what's going on, they're pretty much met with a response of fingers in the air, la, 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 not listening. So I think that we need to really grasp this and see how we can make sure, as a committee, colleagues, we do our duty and uphold the planning policy on parking for Bedminster Green. We've got other developments coming forward, so no doubt this will rumble on.
Yes, thank you, Councillor Powden. Personally, I think actually it's a key precedent because, frankly, how are we going to convince local communities to actually support development locally? We're not putting in the traffic effect, reduction measures. Anyway, that's an argument for somewhere else and at a different time, of course. Can we move to item 5, appeals? You have a copy of these before you. Gary, do you want to comment?
Briefly, Chair, yes. The main thing I just wanted to bring your attention, unless there's any other questions that members had on other matters in that report. First of all, on items 12 and 13, which is on page 15 of your papers. This has been on the papers for quite a long time because, of course, this was the application at Silverthorne Lane for a whole mix of uses, including a new school. It came to DCA committee a considerable time ago. The committee resolved to grant permission, and the application was called in by the Secretary of State due to a flooding objection by the Environment Agency. A public inquiry chaired by an inspector appointed by the Secretary of State was held earlier this year. And so a decision from the Secretary of State had been anticipated by the end of this calendar year, which we're very close to, of course. That is dependent, though, of course, upon the Secretary of State receiving the report from the appointed inspector, and we heard recently that the appointed inspector was due to submit their report to the Secretary of State only around about now, actually. So ministers won't get that until the new year, so I can only estimate that the decision from the Secretary of State will appear in the first 2 to 3 months of 2022, so it's later than anticipated, but that's the explanation around that. And certainly once we hear that, I'm sure there will be publicity on it anyway, but we will formally advise you of that. And then on a similar note, item 14, the former Police Dog and Horse Training Centre, again, that was considered by committee. The committee resolved to grant permission for that. That's the relocation of the caravan club to this site in the Greenbelt. Again, though, that was subject to an objection from the Environment Agency. So similarly, that was also called in by the Secretary of State. There was a public inquiry on that, albeit later than the Silverthorne Lane one. But I understand that the Secretary of State now has the report from the inspector who ran that inquiry, and we had notification a little while ago from government that the decision on that application should be issued around about the first or second week of February. So again, as soon as we get that decision, we will let you know what the outcome is. So that's my update for this time, Chair, unless members had any further questions.
Members? If there's not, can we move on to appeal? Sorry, enforcement.
Thank you, Chair. So pleased to demonstrate some enforcement activity in the way of notices. There's always enforcement activity going on, but as members will know, serving notice is the last resort, albeit something that we're prepared to do if we have to. And that's the case with these two as well, really, because, I mean, purely by coincidence, it's two food stalls in South Bristol with regards to hours of servicing. Just wanted to stress, really, we're not picking on food stalls in these difficult times. In fact, government were very clear 18 months ago that local planning authorities had to be very lenient if food stalls wanted to go beyond their agreed hours of delivery. But, you know, we've come a long way since, and both sites have been the subject to significant complaints. So despite negotiations with both food stores and requests to comply with the hours of operation conditions, that hasn't happened, and so therefore we've served breach condition notices on them. So if any further breaches of that notice would then be an offence that we could then take to Magistrates Court. The food stores do have the opportunity to seek to extend those hours if they want, but again that would be a planning application that would have to be considered following consultation. So that's where we are on those particular notices, Chair, but I'm anticipating further notices going forward.
Super, thanks, Gary. Questions for you?
Yeah, slightly about that. I haven't really come across any enforcement notices against the big supermarkets, and God knows they've been around for long enough. So what's likely to be the outcome if we did take them to court? Would they get a slap on the wrist, a significant fine? I mean, it's unprecedented use of the word unprecedented, but I haven't. I'm surprised and kind of rather pleased, I have to say, because often the perception is that the council gets pushed around by large corporations, and this looks to me as though we're sort of standing up for residents a bit. I could get that wrong, but still. So yeah, what might happen if they go to court?
Yeah, I think if they are in breach, we'd have to provide evidence that they have continued to breach those hours of operation. It would be a clear offence, and they could be open to a successful prosecution. I think it hopefully demonstrates that the planning enforcement system applies to everybody, you know, whether it's a householder or a major, you know, company, really. So everyone has to abide by the rules. I mean, historically, the magistrates' courts haven't dished out too much punishment in terms of enforcement prosecutions, but maybe seeing that it's a large company, they might do. I think it's just one of those things. Yeah, we haven't done this for a large company for some time, but we will see what the response is. But the important thing is that they, you know, if any prosecution is successful, then any further breaches is another offence, and I'm sure the fines and the penalties would be ramped up. But hopefully the serving of notices will just, you know, put the situation right. I mean, hopefully, you know, negotiation would have resolved that, but it hasn't. So we've had to serve formal notices. So hopefully that's the end of the matter, but the breach condition notices are there to ensure that if it isn't the end of the matter, then our next step is to take it to Magistrates Court.
Andrew?
Thank you, Chair. Gary, there was going to be some enforcement served on a site in Brislington West. I think you probably know which one I'm referring to. We were told that was imminent back in, I think, May or June, but I haven't received an update since then. And I wondered maybe by email if you could give me an update if you don't want to do it now.
So, yeah, I think I'll provide that by email if I can. Yes, I've been tracking this fairly closely, and I've seen significant progress over the last 7 days, so I'll be able to give you a positive update, I think, pre-Christmas.
Yeah, I mentioned it at the meeting we had, but I thought I'd just mention it here again. Thank you very much.
Fine. Right, shall we move on to item 8.1? public forum. Now, normally we do this just before each individual item, but in fact we only have one major application today, so it will be in about a minute's time. Can I assure all members of the public, all members of this committee saw your written statements 24 hours ago. So if each of you, when I call you, could go to the central mic and summarise your statement in a minute, I'd be grateful. Sorry, Fee.
I see that we have answers to some of the questions that members of the public have made. Could they...
Could I actually...
Have they seen them?
Yeah. Yeah. You're talking about the next section, which I'm now coming on to say, actually. Mr. Ashdown actually asked questions, and to be fair, that's so unusual, even for me. I had to check the rules, and they aren't like full council formally asked at council, but that's actually submitted to the actual questioner, the replies, and to yourselves as well. He had some issues which I forwarded to the officers, and they've replied this morning. But I'm going to allow Mr. Ashford, when we get to his statement, to actually modify it so he can address himself to say whether he feels his questions were answered or not. So the first statement is from Mr. Simon Hickman. Simon.
Is that working?
Yeah.
Yeah, good. Hi, I'm Simon Hickman. I'm from Historic England, and we're objecting to the St Mary's Laporte scheme, but we are objecting with quite a heavy heart. There's quite a lot to admire here. There's the restoration of the ruined church tower, a beneficial use for the scheduled medieval vaults, the permeability, the connections through to the park and the old city, but fundamentally, it is just too big. Now, this was a densely populated part of the city prior to the devastation of World War II, and it had a grain of little individual buildings of different size and scale, not dissimilar to the old city opposite and the area around St Nick's Market. And your city centre framework, an SPD, asks for that lost grain to be restored, but this scheme doesn't do that. Take 2 floors off, buildings B and C, get some articulation into the roofscapes, and Historic England would enthusiastically endorse this scheme. But as it stands, it's not good enough. Bristol deserves better. I mean, we do think there is some scope for a building of some scale on this site, such as where the Dutch House once stood next to the High Cross. But it's the shoulder buildings, those buildings next to Bristol Bridge and fronting Wine Street, they're too big. Here, the development needs to step down in order to assimilate with the historic context. Building B could be quite interesting.
Sorry, could you bring your statement to a close, please?
Yeah, and as proposed, it would overwhelm the setting of the old city. So we urge you to refuse these plans and encourage the developer to work with Historic England and your council to come up with a revised scheme that respects the unique character and appearance of our city.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Fraser Bridgeford. I believe Fraser's stressing himself to also the statement submitted to by Russ Leaf.
Good afternoon. I see that some members were here when I started my campaigning for Castle Park about 15 years ago. When I arrived in Bristol, they wanted to build on Castle Park, 25% of it. That hasn't happened, thank goodness. We've rebuffed previous applications vigorously and successfully that had little regard for Castle Park and the environment. We believe that the proposal before the committee not only protects the existing park but enhances it and gives careful consideration to the actual interface between the development and the park itself. Members of the Castle Park user group of old have also submitted comments for the planning application and they are supportive. This is a development fit for a park, fit for our park. And as Russ has said in his application, his submission to the committee today, that 90% of those comments on the actual development were supportive. And that's immense. 15 years ago, there would have been 200, 300, 500 people out here on College Green objecting to proposals. Today we see that that's not the case. We set out with the motto of keep Castle Park green, and I do say I've actually still got the T-shirt on at the moment. Thankfully, you say, okay. So hopefully I can get my T-shirt that says kept Castle Park green. Just one other comment about Section 106. Russ mentions security issues in the park and graffiti and CCTV and security and pathways. And I would like to mention the actual landscaping of between St Mary Le Port and St Peter's. There's £1.8 million set aside for transport schemes in Section 106. There are no sums set aside in the papers that are being quantified for the park, and I think that needs to change as part of a decision on this site. I urge you to support this application. Thank you.
Thank you. Fraser, I was unusually supportive and tolerant, bearing in mind you were speaking on behalf of two people. John Taunton, please.
Hi, thank you for letting me speak. Planning policies DM17 and BCS9 and the planning obligations SPD state that where tree loss is essential to allow for a development, replacement trees should be provided in accordance with the tree compensation standard. Though payment into Section 106 may be made to fund off-site replacements, DM17 and the SPD are very clear that trees should be replaced. If trees cannot be replaced, for instance due to lack of suitable sites, paying into Section 106 does not represent compliance with DM17. The developers commit to replacing the trees lost with 63 off-site trees. However, within the permitted area, there are only currently 6 replacement sites available. We ask that the Development Committee insists the applicant provides exact locations of all replacement trees and that each of these should be approved by the relevant landowner before planning approval is given. If precise locations cannot be provided, the application should be rejected as it will have contravened DM17, BCS9 and the SPD. Thank you.
Thank you, Jon. Mark Cashdown.
Thank you, Chair. If I could just address the answers to the questions, please. Just 2 points, really. Our first question related to what justification the developer had presented to justify the removal of 3, arguably 4, but 3 trees as a consequence of archaeological damage alleged to be caused. The answers have given some response, but I would say that none of this evidence has been adduced by the developer. All the evidence, archaeological evidence, the developer has adduced does not demonstrate that there is any basis for these trees to be removed, and I would say it's incumbent on them to do that. Secondly, my next question related to whether or not the city ecologist had commented on the biodiversity net gain metric calculation. I hadn't actually seen their comments until this morning, and having seen them, in fact, Mr. Westbury has summarised them because that's all, if you've read his notes, that's all he had to say about that, and there's no critical analysis of the developer's biodiversity net gain calculation, and we say there should be, if you've read our substantive comments, you'll see we make some substantial comments of why we disagree and why we have a negative biodiversity net gain figure. Again, it's a shame that the city hasn't commented on that in a critical way.
Thank you, Mark. I'll ask the case officer to respond to your comments in his presentation.
Thank you. So, just dealing with my written statement to the committee, you will have read our statements and, I hope, seen answers to our questions. And no doubt you will have diligently scrutinised the many documents, drawings and images which the applicant has submitted, as well as the many comments for and against that have been made by both experts and lay people, including ours. There is no space where more trees might easily be planted, and even if they were, it would take decades to replace what would be lost if these trees are removed, if it ever is. If there is no realistic prospect of replacing these trees, then DM17 makes it clear that approval cannot be given. The building these trees are planned to adorn have fallen into ruins. If we allow these trees, they are likely to see the latest proposal, if approved, also fall into ruins and to be swept away and replaced. I would remind you of the declarations recently made in this very chamber of climate and ecological emergencies and of our commitments to become carbon neutral for 2030 and to double tree canopy in the next 24 years and to protect our open green spaces. Trees are already being lost at an alarming rate. Ash dieback is going to accelerate this trend even more. Declaring an emergency means we must act now, not tomorrow. If not now, when? If not you, who? Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. And finally, Ross Bird. Ross.
Thank you, Chair and committee members. I'm Ros Bird, Commercial Director at MEPC. We've carried out an extensive stakeholder community engagement process, and we appointed a local and very well-respected design team to look at every issue thoroughly. I wanted to highlight just a few areas. Firstly, the site cannot be redeveloped in a policy-compliant way without the loss of some trees, but we've revised the scheme several times to minimise the loss. Secondly, positive environmental and social outcomes are at the heart of everything we do, and we're achieving 85% biodiversity net gain, but we do plan to go beyond that with our environmental net gain proposal to look after nature long term. In terms of social outcomes, we're offering 10% affordable retail units at 30% discount to market rent. And thirdly, our scheme will provide valuable employment space in a key location, supporting a strong mixed-use heart of Bristol. Once the Section 106 is signed and permission issued, we will move swiftly to the demolition. I would like to thank the City Council officers, local councillors, Friends of Castle Park, the BID, Bristol Tree Forum, the Civic Society, the Bristol Walking Alliance and the wider community for their detailed and positive engagement throughout. Thank you.
Thank you. Has anyone turned up expecting to make a statement and not been called, please? No. In that case, we'll move on to the substantive debate. First of all, I'll call Peter Westbury, the case officer, to make his presentation. And in the spirit of the season, we're coming up to Christmas, so I'm going to be incredibly tolerant and generous and allow him 10 minutes more than double the normal 5 minutes. But I'm sure you're willing to abuse that trust, Peter.
Thank you, Chair. I hope this doesn't eat into my 10 minutes, but I'm having trouble with my PowerPoint, and I'm trying something clever to split screens, and it's not working. So, apologies, stop the clock. I will go back to one screen. I do apologise, everyone. My apologies. So the description is on your papers. I won't read that out. A site location plan for you, which just illustrates which buildings are currently on the site. And I just wanted to include that so you have an idea of the footprint. You'll all be familiar with the site and the buildings that are existing there. There were essentially three buildings: Bank House, the Bank of England office block, and also the Norwich Union office building. And there's some pictures of them to just familiarise you with what we're talking about this afternoon. The first thing to say is that this site is allocated for development under the Bristol Central Area Plan Policy BCAP 37. And you will see in that list, and this is in the committee papers, the expectation for the policy. And it is your office's opinion that those requirements are met by the proposal. So that was the first thing that we considered when we were assessing this application. And that just underlines the allocation within the Bristol Central Area Plan. There's also emerging work, and there is now a city centre framework, a strategy for movement and development. And I just highlight this plan, and this is relevant, I think, for consideration, and certainly was part of my assessment, that you'll see that the site is actually 4 quarters, and there is an expectation that all 4 quarters would be developed. But in the interests of the relationship with Castle Park, the developers have come forward with a proposal that actually only does 3 quarters of the site. So we are dealing with 3 buildings today. We could have had a lot more encroachment into the Castle Park area. And there is a knock-on benefit of that in that many more of the trees that might otherwise have been felled have been protected. This is an illustrator. I just wanted to start this to give you a kind of context for the scale of the 3 office blocks that we are dealing with. Just to familiarise, that's obviously Bristol Bridge down in the quarter, down in the bottom left-hand corner. You will have heard the representations of Simon Hickman from Historic England in terms of the scale, and that has been obviously a key material consideration in our assessment of this application. So we have 3 buildings. This is the proposal for what was the Dutch House on the corner there, and Wine Street and High Street. I'll just, you will have seen these, and of course also there was a member briefing, so you'd also seen them there. That's building B, which is the one I think of particular concern to design officers, to Historic England. And I just want to share with you, that's the image that has been particularly carefully considered. And I include that's St Nicholas Church there, and you're standing on Bristol Bridge as you're looking across there, of course. I can come back to that should you wish. So there's Building C. Amendments have been made to Building C to, it will have, you can't quite make it out, but it will have upper level walkways and increased vegetation there. Tree plans, we have taken very seriously the representations of Bristol Tree Forum. That is a plan which again, should you wish, I can return to. Essentially, those trees that are highlighted in green are retained. It's worth noting that during the consideration of, bringing forward the proposals, as you can imagine, we've been discussing this for a long time. Building B was moved back in order to ensure that more trees can be protected. And I think it is not a development where the developers have said, we'll just sweep all the trees away. I think that they have sought to justify where trees have been lost. And there's differences of opinion that you will have heard from Mr. Ashdown on why that's happened. While we're on the subject... Oh, I beg your pardon, Building C. Yeah. Sorry. Oh, beg your pardon, sorry, it's Building C that was moved back, my apologies. I'm so preoccupied with Building B, which is the one next to Bristol Bridge. Just on, before I get on to other aspects of it, how long have I got?
About 5 minutes.
Oh, good, okay. The biodiversity net gain is not yet plan policy, Since this application was submitted, the Environment Bill is now the Environment Act. We are still awaiting government guidance on the implementation of that. Nevertheless, these applicants, and you will have heard from them in their representations to you in the papers about their addressing of biodiversity net gain, and that's the assessment. But it's a secondary assessment until we are given a local plan policy that says we must do it. There are part of the consideration, and it's in the papers, is the economic benefits arising. That's just a quote from the report that I sought the advice of our economic development officers who are supportive of this application, and you will have read that in the papers. But there are considered to be economic benefits for the city as a whole arising from the proposed development. Heritage, we have, as part of the assessment of the application, Historic England have assessed the application as less than substantial harm. You will have, those of you who were at the briefing will have heard the applicant's heritage consultant give you advice on that. Less than substantial harm is still has that word harm in it, so we have to take it very carefully. Those are the surrounding heritage assets. In addition, it's in a conservation area that surround this site. So it's been dealt with very carefully and weighed up against the economic benefits of the scheme. Those are a list of the assets, and we can return to that should you wish. And that's the assessment that we have done in terms of Historic England's advice. We have not overlooked Historic England. We have taken their advice very carefully, and that is our conclusion on the basis of harm that would be less than substantial harm in terms of the National Planning Policy Framework guidance that we have to work to, and the details of that are in the committee papers. There's the view, looking back, that's a view from Castle Park, just to give you an idea of the scale, so looking back toward Bristol Bridge there. Just some images to include there. And there is the recommendation that is before you this morning. That's included in the amendment sheet as well. There are Section 106 requirements that we are seeking, if you are minded to approve, permission to go away and finalise the details of the Section 106 agreement. So, but it is a recommendation of your officers that on balance this application should be approved. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Peter. I'm particularly pleased to say you managed that in less than 10 minutes, so I won't have to press the button to plunge you down into a crocodile-infested pit, so that's good. We now move to questions for the benefit of Councillor Bennett, probably not Councillor Jackson, who's been here before. This is the time for questions, not points of view. So I'll move to that. Can I just pose two questions which may address some points, and then we'll move to questions from the floor. Firstly, can I raise again a question I raised at the briefing, just so it's on the public record? Obviously, this is zoned freely for employment space, though the broader Broadmead area is becoming and will become, according to our developing planning policies, more mixed, of course. But the question was, with the effects of COVID, say, is there deemed to be the demand for large office blocks like this?
Yes, thanks, Chair. In fact, the allocation is quite flexible. Obviously, the allocation was written a number of years ago before COVID and the resulting economic difficulties. But the allocation was for a mix of uses. I think that was to so it wasn't a mono-use development, and this is offices but a ground floor. We're expecting a variety of active uses, so that's the permission being sought. And you know, it's at the moment, the site has a very limited economic benefit and in terms of activity. I won't talk too much about that because it's fairly obvious, I think. We deal with a number of sites, clearly this site, and, you know, we do talk to the applicants in terms of, you know, the issues around their application, but also as part of that is the, you know, the interest that they're getting from potential occupiers, obviously still at a relatively early stage of the process with still uncertainty as to planning status, of course, which is why we're here today. But we also deal with a number of developers around the city centre as well. And, you know, it's fair to say that, you know, Bristol is quite fortunate really in that there's still a lot of activity going on, a lot of confidence in both in developers implementing office permissions and commercial permissions, and also progressing draft schemes to applications that could then be implemented. So, you know, the proof of the pudding would be in the eating, but I think, Chair, we're hearing a lot of positive noises in terms of demand for high quality office spaces within the city centre.
Thanks, Gary. My second question pertains to Mr. Ashdown's statements and questions. Obviously, he made a number of assertions about the loss of trees could preclude granting this consent. Now, could you directly address that, either Peter or Gary?
Yes, thanks, Chair. I mean, both in the presentation, also in the original committee papers, there's a really useful diagram that shows, you know, the significant trees around the site and those that are what value they are. They're largely either category A or category B, and also the ones that it is considered have to go in order to accommodate the development. And there has been change during discussions. So building C, which is in the top right-hand corner of the site, that did come away from the frontage to allow retention of more trees, but nonetheless there are still some trees going as a result of the development. And, you know, it is true that our policies do say, you know, the policy on trees, unsurprisingly, is quite keen on retaining trees, really. And it's DM17, and that does say, you know, trees should be retained. So clearly, with regards to that, there is a policy issue. But as members will know, that there's a whole host of policies that have to be applied to planning applications, and quite often it's a balance. And just coming back to the, you know, the legislation, which I think is also set out in the report, you know, whilst the policy seeking retention of trees, alongside all the other policies, that's development plan policy, so isn't strictly in accordance with that development plan policy. But the legislation allows you still to give greater weight to other material considerations, and they can be other policies that the scheme may or may not be compliant with, but it can also be the other things such as the design, the economic benefits, whether they're benefits or detractors, really. So development doesn't have to slavishly accord with every single policy. What you have to do is assess the scheme against all of them and attach weight to all of them in coming to your overall judgment.
Thanks, Gary. Fee.
I got two questions. One of them, it's back on the tree issue, actually. Can you clarify the status of replacement trees? Because Mr. Ashdown seemed quite clear that we have to be able to demonstrate a location where those replacement trees would go. Can you clarify the policy point for us, please? And you know, bearing in mind, as you say, that policy, you look at the weight of it. It's not all applied absolutely, but there is a weight applied to it. And secondly, it's a bit of an old chestnut, which we come back to quite a few times, really. Climate emergency. We've got a declaration of climate emergency in this council. My understanding is that until the new local plan is adopted, which presumably one would hope will incorporate stronger climate emergency elements, we are stuck with our current policy. Or how much weight do we give our declaration of climate emergency, if I've got that wrong? If you can clarify those 2 points for me, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. The clarity on status of replacement trees. The precise location of the replacement trees is to be confirmed. That will form part of the work for the Section 106 agreement, which will also include a sum for replacement trees elsewhere. So there will be replacement trees, but we don't know
My
yet
question was
where they'll
more,
be.
how much weight do we have to know the location of these replacement trees as part of our decision making?
I don't think we can,
You're not sure?
actually,
Okay.
is the answer to the question at this stage.
So in regard to the weight given to the Council's declared climate emergency, as Councillor Hants alluded to, really, our development plan position is of some age, and that there are policies in there that expect certain standards from developments that are probably not as ambitious as we would want, but that they are the main policies that we have got there. That's where the main weight needs to go. If there are other standards in the National Planning Policy Framework, then clearly we'd have to give significant weight to those as well. But I'm not aware that they are so far beyond the local plan policies that, you know, we're looking at a different kind of set of standards, really. So it's a difficult message to give across, but in terms of the actual declaration of the climate emergency, in planning terms, in terms of dealing with specific planning applications, I don't feel you can give that significant weight. But where that will get addressed is through the local plan review, and of course that's tied to the sub-regional situation. But you know, there'll be updates on that in the next 6 months or so. But it's one of those frustrations for all of us, really, that planning policy, which is where we can really attach significant weight and make real impacts in terms of decisions. It takes time to come through, really, and that's the situation we're still in at the moment.
Tom?
Thank you, Chair. I had a couple of questions. We talked about the biodiversity net gain, and I'm aware that we can't give that too much weighting at the moment because it's not quite legislation for us to follow. But can I just check that the figure they've supplied, is that using an old metric? Because I understand there's been a new one brought forward which does have a function for including street trees, whereas the older one doesn't. And I just wanted to pick back up on the talk about office space demand. I'm aware that in the report it says that we've received some evidence that there's interest, but I just wondered if that evidence had come pre or post Lloyd's announcing that they were going to shed their building down by the amphitheatre. And just on the talk of revising footprints and moving buildings back, I wanted to know if there'd been any investigation into retaining those high quality trees that are lost due to the current footprint of, I think it's building A. And my final question was just around the St Nicholas Market. Obviously, this redevelopment's got quite a lot of potential for St Nick's Market, but I just wondered what kind of engagement there'd been with the traders there. I understand they use part of that plot for loading and unloading at the moment.
We're struggling to get absolute confirmation of which metric the applicant's biodiversity net gain was assessed on. Given the timing, I'm assuming it was metric 2. I'm getting nods, so that was an informed guess. The thing with biodiversity net gain, because there is work going on within the council in terms of working towards climate emergency, ecological emergency, biodiversity net gain, which will become a legal requirement in the next 18 months, 2 years, doubling the tree canopy of the city. All those things need to be coordinated together. So that work is in the early stages, but it is happening. But in terms of dealing with biodiversity net gain, as an assessment tool. The council doesn't really have a formal position at the moment, so we can't give you an absolute view on biodiversity net gain, pass or fail, and which metric we think is the right one. Clearly, metric 3 is the most up-to-date one, but that's come in since the application was lodged. So, you know, we go back to the, well, what does the local plan and the PPF expect in terms of, you know, avoiding harm to ecology? And you know, I think overall we would say, however you quantify it, you know, this will have, you know, enhancement in terms of ecological value to the site. Office space demand, in terms of the, you know, I think the Lloyd's announcement was fairly recent, so what we're hearing, what we have heard was pre-Lloyd's decision to kind of shrink back into their neighbouring office. I'm not an expert on office demand in the market, but I would highlight that the Lloyd's building, whilst, you know, it's a significant building in the city, is of its age really, so that might play some part in that process as well. And you know, if the site's on the market, then you know we're all keen to know how that's going to come forward. It may come forward even for an office refurb, because it's a really good location, but the actual type of accommodation may not be what's available on the market from brand new accommodation that's being built out at the moment. The retention of trees, I think we've worked with these applicants and previous owners of the site for a number of years really, and the delivery of development on the site whilst retaining as many trees as possible has been a huge challenge really. And I think as officers, I think we whilst it was always going to be tested at committee, we've always understood that we'd be dealing with a degree of tree loss and therefore application of the tree replacement standard as much on site but also off site as well. I personally was pleasantly surprised when Building C moved and came south so that it retained the trees along the road frontage. So I think that was a real benefit, but ultimately, you know, trees will be lost as a result of the development. But as Peter set out in his presentation as well, you know, it would be easy for the applicants to point to a city centre framework diagram and say, well, hold on a minute, you were, you know, subject to detail, you're advocating for building plots on here, and that bottom right one would have, you know, removed a significant number of trees, and whether that would have gone through the planning process is another matter, but still it was a signal that the council had put out there that really 4 plots on the site could be built out. So again, I think this is a benefit of this scheme against what was alluded to in the city centre framework. And then finally, in terms of St Nick's Market, I know I've been, you know, there have been some wider meetings with council colleagues. There's a markets team, obviously work really closely with St Nick's Market. I think, you know, I've heard positive noises from them in terms of, you know, improving footfall in, you know, across Castle Park into their site and back across again, and those real benefits. But I have also heard about, well, hold on, the practicalities about where we park our vehicles and that at the moment, and that's just something that will have to be worked through. We have a regeneration team in the City Council. They cover a whole host of services like economic development, the comments that we got, property, because the council is also the freeholder of this site as well, and also the markets team. So our regen colleagues, you know, they are aware of that issue that still needs to be worked through, and obviously depending on what happens with this application, they will re-engage with the traders in the market to kind of work through the details of how that will look.
Andrew.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Peter, for the report. Just regarding plot 4, obviously a lot of people are concerned about the height and scale of the 3 buildings and its impact on heritage assets. Historic England suggested that if plot 4 were to be built upon, then you could reduce the heights of the 3 existing buildings. Was that sort of looked into? What was the discussion about plot 4? Was it just about saving trees and enhancing the connection with the park? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I think this is a classic example of weighing up the issues, as Gary has been speaking about. It's a classic example of that. The relationship with Castle Park was weighing heavily on our mind. We have an allocation which is actually quite a tight allocation, even if all four quarters. It's not a big site, it's 1.2 hectares, not much space there really. So it's kind of weighing it all up and what's more important. So we've got a scheme which, yes, there is height, and that you will have heard concern, and you will read in the paper, in the report that I prepared. There was a bit of, I think the applicants came in at the outset and were saying we will only develop 3 parts because we understand. And that came from them, and that came out of their public consultation and the importance of Castle Park and so on. So it's, yeah, I mean, it would be a completely different proposal, but we're trying to just balance it all out, as Gary has said.
Philippa?
Thank you. Yes, thank you very much for the report, and thank you to people for their comments, which have been really helpful. Thank you. I've just got 3 questions. One is about the carbon dioxide reductions, which I believe is less than the 20% requirement. Just wondered if you'd had discussions about that. Secondly, wonder if you've had discussions about building in safety and security into the design in terms of, you know, at the moment, I wouldn't go for a walk in that park after dark. If you've sort of looked into that, how this would improve that for particularly women and vulnerable people. And the third question is to do with the issue of scale and height. I'm just wondering if you had discussions about Historic England said that, you know, if it was 2 stories lower, they'd welcome it with open arms. I wondered if you'd had those discussions and why it is why it is proposed to be the height it is. Thanks.
I keep on being Gary's whispering. I'll take which ones, the questions that were taken. The figure is in the region of 16% reduction. The applicants, well, first thing to say is that there's a condition about that. The applicants are confident that when the finer details come forward, that will increase to the 20%. So, but I'm saying at the moment, at the very least, it should be the 16% reduction. So we're getting there, and we'll probably get over the line once we've got the detailed proposals, and we can deal with that through discharge conditions and so on. Safety and security, again, that will be the lighting of it. There are proposals within, and you can imagine I have a wealth of documents, a huge amount of documents, and within there are security measures and lighting plans and so on. There are conditions about the hard and soft landscaping, so that will be part of that and how that will be dealt with. We will have, though, a scheme which is not accessible to the members of the public. You have to walk around High Street and Wine Street. It reintroduces St Mary Le Port Street going through from St Nicholas Market, and that will have lighting proposals, but it's in the finer detail of that coming forward.
Yes, scale and height, yes. But yeah, the number of issues around this application, that's been the most thorny one, it really has. And you'll see that in the report, you know, we've come to an on-balance recommendation. You know, it's an issue that a lot of people have quite rightly felt very passionate about, really. So it's been on the agenda of all our discussions pre-app and during the application as well, really. Yeah, ideally, we would have, you know, buildings that are not as tall as those, because they'd have a reduced impact, and it would, for officers, you know, reporting to yourselves, it would make the balance of, harm versus benefits easier. But, the scheme is the scheme before us, really. We had some very honest and robust conversations with the applicants about scale and height, and I think their response has been sort of twofold, really. One, genuinely, they feel that the height and scale is the right height and scale for the site, so that it hasn't been, an apologetic, oh yeah, we think it should be lower, but it has to be such. So they've been very kind of honest in that regard. But also, whilst we don't go into viability assessments on commercial development in the way that we do when we're negotiating affordable housing, the response has been, well, but to make the site deliverable, it has to be so. We need this quantum of floor space, really. And so, that's the applicants talking, but the council also has a role that, as planners, we're not too close to, but as the council has a role as freeholder. So they have, officers, colleagues of ours do have some awareness of those viability issues and some knowledge of that. And, they have said, they've kind of agreed with that, really, and said that, look, bringing this site forward, I mean, there's a reason why it's been derelict or, only partially occupied and in the condition it's in for so long, for good reasons. To bring it forward with all the kind of abnormal costs on there, working around the vaults and various other issues around there, there will be real viability challenges. So the kind of informal view we've got from those colleagues is, well, actually, yes, you probably would need something of this order in order to deliver a scheme on the site. So, and that's why we've reached the position we have done now, really. We're at a point in time, the scheme is the scheme. We've had all the discussions around it. And so our on-balance assessment of that is set out in the report.
Ed?
Thank you, Chair. I'm actually going to address that. I was going to address that point anyway. You partly answered what I was going to say. I've got 4 questions. Both the trees and the 20% energy figure were assured that will come through when there's more detail. I was unaware, actually, that we shouldn't really be allowing something to go through without knowing where the other trees will go. But I'm guessing that will come through with the delegated discussions. Is there anything we can do to make sure there's a strong condition to make sure that actually happens? Around the office space, particularly with more and more discussion about 15-minute neighbourhoods and mixed-use development, I kind of assumed that mixed-use development would imply residential, particularly on something of this scale. So I'm somewhat surprised not to see some residential provision within that, maybe at the top. There's a lot of concern about heights, and we're told that it must be justified. I was going to ask, why is there no sort of viability or deliverability assessment? You've said, well, that's not something we normally do, and we've done very much an informal process. Don't we have anything stronger in our tool mix just to test that out? Because at the moment we seem to be sort of doing it very informally and very much based on the word of the applicant. And lastly, the Transport 106, I noticed that the Civic Society had a number of concerns about particularly High Street and Wine Street, and I was wondering if the negotiated Transport Section 106 settlement actually will address that, or if actually we can't deal with the Civic Society's concerns because this is going to be a mass transit route.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just making notes, forgive me. Yes, in answer to your first question, yes, conditions, that is, if you were to suggest, then that is part of the role here, and you can suggest that, and we can incorporate that. Oh, Gary has just whispered I would do the others. So.
Well, apart from the final one, I'm looking to my colleague to answer the last one. Yeah, mixed use, because, like I said, the allocation is pretty flexible, as for a variety of uses. Yeah, ideally, we'd have, real, rich mix of uses on the site. And that's, those were the subject of early discussions with the applicants. The response back to that was no, this is a commercial a commercial office-led development. Residential development is different. You know, it's what the current applicants specialise in. We in the past we've had discussions with housing developers as well, and I think as planning officers, whilst a richer mix would be beneficial, it's not something that we can hang a policy objection on really. And cities are changing really, because I know nearby here, more dated office space was converted under permitted development rights to residential. So I think it just shows the evolution of cities really, that whilst you might have a scheme that's it's largely office, and where's the residential? Well, the residential's happening in different ways really, and I'm sure will continue to happen in other parts of the city centre, not a million miles away. So from an officer perspective, we're not at all worried about that really. And then in terms of the weighing up the harm versus the deliverability stroke benefits, we're not able to ask for formal viability information on that, because we only can when it comes to affordable housing, because it does say subject to viability, 30% subject to viability or 40%. So that allows us to say, right, okay, let's see that information, we'll get it assessed. The approach of the council is it's completely open and transparent, so we can't operate that system for commercial development. So what we're left with is that really difficult planning balance of, weighing up, the pros and the cons of a development, and that's a really difficult thing to do. We're here to help you as much as we can and give our view on that balance, but ultimately it's a decision for the committee members as individuals, and then obviously collectively. So sorry, I can't give you any more kind of a formal steer on the process than that really.
So one final question.
Yeah, Lawrence will answer that one on the 106.
Thanks, Gary. Just addressing the section 106. As you know, there's the Bristol Bridge closure and traffic ban in the area. That's really just the start of the improvements that we're seeking in that area. So if you were to turn up the city centre framework, that talks about improved pedestrian and cycle linkages through Castle Park, High Street, Wine Street, and also the delivery of a mass transit route, which would go from an M32 park and ride out to Long Ashton. So High Street and Wine Street becomes really important when assessing this site and the extra footfall that this site generates. And as part of that is an environmental improvement, which you'll see some of in the application on the front site frontage, and the rest will be Section 106 contribution towards ourselves to develop proposals to improve the public realm in Wine Street and High Street, and also Castle Park. So we have shared drawings with the applicant which show what our vision will be for that going forward, and that of course will be subject to further public consultation at a later date.
Could I follow up quickly on that final contribution, and also picking up on Fraser Bridgeford's contribution statement? It seems to me that primarily the Section 106 monies are being put towards transport minimisation, and his point is, when are we going to see some money being spent on Castle Park? I'm assuming, and perhaps I ought to ask Peter, not yourself, Lawrence. The reason is, I guess, parks type funding can be funded by non-strategic cells, so the area committee of which Central Ward forms a part could vote for that. And of course, being a Central Ward, they have more cell than anywhere else.
We're fighting over answering that one, Chair. I'm sure we'd say the same thing. In answer to your question, Chair, yes, that's correct. The Transport 106 contributions that we are looking to secure, they meet. We can't just. There are kind of tight guidelines and regulations over 106 contributions, and so it has to be directly related to the impacts of the development in scale and kind. There's been lots of healthy debate with the applicants over that, but we have our position, which is what we've set out in the amendment sheet. Much more difficult to do that in terms of enhancements to the park, and you're correct, really, in terms of assuming that it wouldn't be a strategic sill matter, because that's more kind of citywide or transport corridors and things like that. I anticipate it would be more of a non-strategic sill matter that, and as you rightly say, the non-strategic sill for the relevant committee would be, the pot there is probably pretty significant actually. Albeit this development, apart from the retail, the office is zero sill, but obviously it's pulled from various other developments, student accommodation, residential as well. So even then, I think that sill pot is probably still significant.
I think Peter had a point.
Yes, just in addition, there are, as part of the Section 106, there will be contributions towards public toilets in Castle Park, and also to improve cycle routes through the park. So that's in addition, just to mention that as well.
And thinking aloud, clearly a condition would be inappropriate, but surely this committee could actually, if they were binded to support the application, but add an advice note to the area committee saying we would like to see more sustained investment in Castle Park.
Yeah, I'd suggest that as an additional line on the resolution, because the advice note is for the applicants, and the applicants I'm sure would be very interested in it, but I think the line of communication would be to the area committee.
Okay, that's fine. So, Marley.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Peter, for your report. I suppose it's another question sort of relating to the height and scale, but it's particularly on the impact of park shadowing. I was just wondering sort of what assessments being carried out about the impact that this development would have on sort of the hours of sunlight in the park. I know one of the advantages of the Castle Park's position currently is it gets quite good sunlight in sort of the afternoon and the evening. So I was wondering sort of how this development would impact that, what portion of the park would be impacted.
Thank you, Chair. I have a huge pile of documents, and I know it's in there somewhere, and it would take me a bit of time to actually find that. I think the short answer is, of course, it will have an impact on Castle Park. That cannot be denied. It will cause shadow. It will have an impact there in terms of in comparison to what is there. I will try in the interim, if there are other questions, to kind of search out the answer to it in terms of like the percentage loss. I might struggle with that just sitting here to find that. Apologies.
Nice. Thank you.
In that case, sorry, Chris.
Thank you, Chair. I've got just one issue, what might have been covered. I'm looking at the tree plan. There's a lot of trees that obviously will be removed. Just for me, how much effort have been into with the developers? Because looking at the plan on here, some of those shouldn't be impacted on. So I'm wondering why so many of those trees are being removed when on the plan, especially where Area 4 was, there's quite a few trees in that area, and there's no development there that's going to be removed. And I just wondered why, and has every effort been made to keep every single tree? Please.
Thank you, Chair. Every effort has been made to keep as many trees as possible. That's the message in terms of this proposal. So very careful consideration. The other thing I should have added as well is in terms of that, there are recommended conditions to protect trees during construction. I should have mentioned that. That's part of the recommendation. So every effort has been made to retain as many trees as possible.
That answer. I'm just asking why those trees in that area an Area 4, or what would have been Area 4, and is now not being developed, why all of those can't be retained?
I think, Chair, looking at the ones that are, because they're the ones with the red cross hatching, they are the ones that are in closest proximity to the church tower of St Mary Le Port. So I think they are, whether they are impacting upon, because one of the heritage benefits is the, the protection of the church tower and providing it with a, reinstating to a degree its setting. I think they're either trees that are directly impacting now, or ones that would, I think, would benefit from removal to kind of support the public realm approach around the church tower. So I think whilst they're not affected by new buildings as such, what they are affected by is the plans to bring the church tower back to life and bring it back to a more prominent place within the city. So I think that's.
I think with that we're moved to actually the debate, if that's all right. I think members have had a fair chance to ask appropriate questions, so I'll start the debate if I may. Well, the point is, am I correct? If you do miss, we have to adjourn, or we'll wait till you return, because otherwise you can't vote.
Could I ask one more question?
No,
not
we're
at all.
not about a meeting.
No, okay.
So, yeah. To be honest, we're not a meeting, we're adjourned. Yes.
For the area committee.
No, that's an advice note. I can do that. The thing which you seem to be something to, although I'm not sure it's deliverable, is like a condition about, can we see alternative off-site sites for new trees? I'm not sure we need that, but yeah, I didn't think you can do that because under present situation.
In the 106 there'll be a mechanism to say, because it's just about money to get on what sites, so there'll be a mechanism in the 106.
You can appreciate your convenience is very much at the top of my obligations, of course, Councillor Jackson. Councillor Plowden's asked to ask a question just actually when we reconvene, which I'm happy to accede to. Before then, in the break, I did have a word with Gary and Peter to ask whether we can incorporate and firm up what Councillor Plowden was asking about actually off-site tree locations. So, Gary, do you want to comment?
Yes, thank you, Chair. So, the tree replacement mechanism would be in the Section 106 agreement, because it involves a financial contribution, but it's not just about the financial contribution. It's about where the tree is, where the trees would go, because obviously it's got to benefit the locality and not be planted on the edge of the city. So there would be an appropriate mechanism in the 106 to obviously secure the correct amount in accordance with the tree replacement standard, but also to ensure that the optimum location for such replacements is found. So we can make doubly sure that the instructions to our legal team actually set out such a mechanism, and we'll keep a close eye on that.
And Claudette, we'll see if committee's minded shortly to approve or not this application, but if it is, could I ask you to make that clear in the minutes? Fine.
My one question was, I seem to remember, possibly during the pre-election period, an announcement being made by the previous administration that Castle Park would be the beneficiary of a large-scale investment. And I think that was from Strategic Sill. Are you aware of that at all, as officers?
Sorry, Chair, no, not directly. I mean, whilst obviously the planning application process generates and ultimately collects SIL, our focus, albeit fairly narrowly, is on the kind of the Section 106 element and ensuring that the mitigation is secured rather than anything more strategic beyond that. So, and obviously in discussions with the applicants, whilst relationship to the park and future enhancements have been talked about with these applicants and other potential applicants around the park as well, it's not got down to the level of detail of, right, Section 106 requires you to pay X. So I'm sorry, I'm not aware of that particular initiative.
In my humble experience, Councillor Powden, what's said in an election campaign like Brislington Meadows bears very little relation to what happens in reality. Right, having said that, I think we've disposed of questions. Shall we move to the debate? Shall I kick off? This committee, in my view, has a solemn duty to examine all major applications for development in this city which comes here. This is particularly so in historic sites, and I can think of few more historic sites than this, which was blitzed by the Luftwaffe in the last war. Particularly since many people have criticised us and said, in fact, the city planners have done more damage than the German Air Force. I think it behoves us to consider this site carefully. I also have slight emotional links with this location, if a Tory can have emotions, that is. Bearing in mind in the mid-80s, my first job was on site, although I wasn't employed by the Bank of England. One time for my sins, I was incarcerated and trapped in their underground vaults, but there we are. Perhaps Councillor Jackson will venture that it's unfortunate they eventually released me. Seriously, to me, there are a number of issues here. First of all, in land use terms, clearly this type of development, employment use, even if the border Broadmead area is going to become more mixed in land use, is appropriate. It's also quite appalling when I think back that we're talking of decades. It's been derelict and redundant, and it's a key location right at the heart of our city. So this development, these proposals, in my view, have not come too soon. There's clearly controversy about the design and the scale. although I recognise and treasure many historical buildings, I don't believe that we have to create pastiches of the past like the Dutch House say. And I also feel this is appropriate for this location. I actually think, and I believe actually, it enhances Castle Park, as we've heard from the public forum. But in fact, Castle Park is, in my view, a bit like New York Central Park. So large buildings surrounding it may be appropriate and may actually add to the attractiveness of the location, but that's a personal view, which you may or may not agree with. With regard to the trees, it seems to me, and clearly this has been a key issue, that significant efforts have been made to save trees. The movement of building C to the southwest of Wine Street has achieved that, and actually not building a fourth building at all and leaving the southeast of the site free is beneficial. I'm also gratified with the 25, I think, ground floor retail units, pubs and restaurants and shops, which are going to go there. I do hope they manage to be like independent and are not part of national chains. I think that will only be beneficial. And I note with pleasure that 10% should be affordable rented. I'm also impressed with the transport improvements proposed and the vaults enhancements, and not least, of course, the fact that St. Mary Le Port Church Tower itself will be saved and enhanced. So overall, I think this is a positive scheme, a good scheme for the city, and I'll be voting for it. V?
It's times like this, I'm really glad I'm not a planning officer, I have to say, because it's a really complex site, and the phrase on balance is used over and over again because it's not an easy one. I would have preferred to see a development proposed that didn't remove the trees, and I prefer to see one that is less imposing. That said, as I think as Fraser said, I'm long enough in the tooth to remember some absolute horror shows of planning proposals or ideas for developing Castle Park over the years, which have involved huge amounts of tree loss. And this one, although I personally think, I really don't like it, but this isn't about my personal opinion. There is a significant amount of land left undeveloped. Our job here is not to think about whether we like this or not, it's whether it complies with current planning policy. And some of us may take issue with current planning policy and think it's weak in certain areas, but that's what we're stuck with and that's what we've got. So, with slightly less enthusiasm than you, Richard, I have to say, I think I'm going to be voting for this. Yeah, it's not the most beautiful development, but it's better than what we've got, and it's a sight better than some of the proposals in the past.
Chris?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, there's lots of pluses and minuses to this site. I'm very, very pleased with the toilets. I think that's a great. The cycling and pedestrian improvements is also excellent. The mixed use is about time because we've had massive office blocks or we've had areas where it's just shops. So I'm pleased with that. I'm also minded to take on the Friends of group are supporting this application. That's very, very good. I mean, the site is an eyesore, and it's been an eyesore for as long as I can remember. And I have been in there. We had a fire in the vaults once, which was very nice because I didn't realise how much gold was down there. But that was a long time ago. There are some negatives. Sorry, just one more positive. Sorry, only 3 of the 4 sites are being developed, which I think is good. And that may well be why one of the negatives is the height of building B. Very, very nice building, and I like the ups and the downs of it, but I'm concerned with the shadowing into the park. That is one of my big concerns, and the same is with feet. I can't see why a lot of those trees, looking at the tree plan, why they can't be saved, which is why I asked that earlier on. And I'd like to see the eco net gain, the ecology, in this. You're asking us to approve this when we're at 16%. We're trying to get to 20. There's a lot of stuff that should be here in black and white, which is not here in black and white. But looking at it, I think it's going to be a great help to that area to regenerate it, to help the other shops and like the St Nicholas Market. So although I have got some concerns about it, mainly shadowing in the trees, I will be voting in favour of this application.
Thank you. Andrew?
Thank you, Chair. Like everyone else here, I'm sure I was really excited when I heard that there was a scheme coming forward for this site. Obviously, I fully support the development of this location. It's a long derelict brownfield site in the heart of the city. It's restoring important heritage assets, especially St Mary Le Port Church, which is on the verge of falling down, and the medieval vaults, which are fascinating. I saw a little video clip about them recently, very interesting. I think the scheme works really well up close when you're kind of walking around the scheme at street level. I think the recreation medieval street plan is really pleasing. The active street frontages look fantastic. The link with St Nicholas Market looks really good. Unfortunately for me, where the scheme falls down is on the effect of surrounding heritage assets. This is probably one of the most prominent sites in the city. And I think the view from various locations of the three buildings, they just appear to be too overbearing, too monolithic, too blocky, and a very negative impact on the surrounding areas. I'm particularly concerned about the view from Bristol Bridge of Building B. I just think it's totally overbearing on the neighbouring St Nicholas Church. I'm also concerned with the view from within Castle Park itself. Unlike you, Councillor Eddy, I don't want to create Central Park in Castle Park. I don't think that's appropriate for Bristol. It's certainly not on that old historic city side of the park. So I'm just worried that we are going to replace one set of unpopular buildings with another set, and I really don't want to put my name to it. Obviously, I'm not in favour of some kind of pastiche, some kind of recreation of the old city. That's not possible. But I just think we need a better scheme for this prominent location. Thank you.
Thanks. Tom?
Thank you, Chair. This is a major development on a really significant site in the city. And as we've all said, I fully support the redevelopment of the current eyesore, and there's clearly aspects to be welcomed in this, such as reinstating the historic streets and the ambition of the site, including mixed retail at ground level. But for me, along with the missing detail on the 20% residual carbon reductions, the thing that's holding me back is the grave loss of 13 urban street trees, over half of which we've heard are identified as high quality. It's clear from the submissions of the Woodland Trust and the Tree Forum that the harm from the development is significant on our goals to improve canopy cover, biodiversity, and to decarbonise the city. These trees have around 70 years of growth, and clearly there's no replacing that with new young trees. Plus, I think we all know from area committee how difficult it is to replace street trees. Mature street trees are also not properly represented in the biodiversity metric calculator they've used to gain the figure presented, though I take that we can't formally include that as a consideration. As has been pointed out, our local policies BCS 9 and DM17 state that individual green assets should be retained wherever possible and integrated into new development, and I'm not entirely convinced that there's a justification for that not being possible here, particularly given other concerns raised about the size and massing of the buildings. So in summary, for such a significant site in the city, I don't think we should be settling for voting through gritted teeth on this proposal.
Thank you, Tom. Ed.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to thank officers who've done a really, not only the planning officers, but all the officers and the developers who've obviously worked together, and the developers who obviously have engaged to produce what overall is a good scheme, and they've really listened. And I echo the Councillor Varney in saying that I think at street level this will work well. I think everyone wants to see this eyesore redeveloped. I used to work directly opposite in Prudential Buildings, and remember every Wednesday the street would be closed with armed police delivering large van loads of cash to the site. And I have heard today that the very long delay in dealing with this site is probably because it's very complex and difficult, and therefore we need to make compromises, and I do accept that. I am very concerned about the trees, and that's why I'd like to see some sort of making sure that we can replace those trees, even though that's not really going to be good enough retrofitting. But because they're almost impossible to replace in the centre, we've run out of space and there's utilities everywhere. But I'm afraid to say B&C are too high. I think if they were each subject to their own application, they would probably fail because they're just too high and too massive. The balance sheet that we've used, and I accept we have to do that, seems to include the preservation of the church and the vaults, but I think this should be taken as read. And I think then we should move on from that point and start looking at the height and the fact that the old city is overwhelmed. And this is our most historic environment. The origins of Bristol are in Saxon times at the bridge. So the mock-ups, they look out of scale and too massive compared with everything around them. I haven't heard enough justification on business case or whatever else it is not to take it down by 2 stories, particularly buildings B and C. We're not New York. I've just Googled it. Central Park is 100 times the area of Castle Park. So it's a very different thing. It is large. Very different situation, and we're not New York. We shouldn't pretend to be. So I echo with a heavy heart Historic England and say that I'm going to struggle to do this. I would like to see it deferred and see whether or not losing a couple of stories of particularly buildings B and C might be something that I genuinely believe that if the developers have shown themselves to be brilliant negotiators and listeners, and wonder if we could defer this and ask for whether or not a bit more factual evidence around the viability could be brought forward in order to help us make a decision in the future.
Thank you, Ed. Though, can I remind you, I know you've had your DC training quite recently, that actually our role is not to actually redesign in committee any application. Perhaps if there's quite a small scheme, a deferral may be appropriate, but I think a solution is more likely to come here by either granting this or refusing it, which gives a clear message to the applicant. Does anyone else wish to speak? Philippa?
Thank you. And I think this is, as everyone else has said, this is one of the most difficult ones ever. We've really got a real responsibility, to people now and in the future to get this right. And there are loads of brilliant aspects to the scheme, but I'm just so worried that it just doesn't, the scale just doesn't fit with what's around. And actually the colour, the red colour, I know it's meant to echo what's on the other side, but when I was walking around the area yesterday with my map in the rain, I couldn't picture how that sort of fits in with the historic thing there. And I don't think we want a pastiche of what's been there before, but it just, I don't know, it just doesn't quite feel right, even though there's lots of really brilliant aspects to the scheme, as everyone else has said. So I'm just saying what everyone else has said.
Thank you. Marley?
Thank you, Chair. So a number of issues. The one that I sort of raised previously about park shadowing and the impact the scale, the height of this development has sort of is a concern for me, but I'm sort of willing to defer to the friends of group who do support this proposal when I was making that consideration. I think there's some really positive parts of the proposal. The fact that it's providing these retail spaces and the initiatives that are included to support sustainable transport are things I really support. And sort of one of the things that I was considering throughout was the difficulties in developing what is a complex site, just in a prime location. I suppose, yeah, the tree issue as well, it's been covered a lot, but, you know, I think there's some credit on the fact that one of the plots that could be developed isn't being developed, and the fact one of the buildings has been moved to protect trees. So, you know, would have liked to see stronger assurances that even more trees that could have been protected were. Finally, on the height itself, I would have liked to see it at height more in keeping with the surrounding buildings, or at least seen strong assurances development at a lower height would not have been deliverable. At the risk of incurring fees and Philippa's wrath, I actually think it looks quite attractive. My concern is is simply it's slightly too imposing. So on balance, I'm prepared to support this proposal, but do have some concerns.
Thank you, Molly. When Councillor Jackson mentioned the impact on the park and the shadowing, which you also have raised, I did ask Peter to look at this, and he's got some information for us.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to draw your attention to the committee report, and there is a section on park shadowing. Yes. You got it? Okay. That was what
I was just wondering if there was diagrams or anything.
Yeah,
I would have liked to have seen, you know, a map of at 5 o'clock. This is where the shadows would be, but
yeah.
Are there any more contributions?
Oh, this is really hard. I'm just really concerned that if we don't vote for this, we'll get something coming back that's going to build over that fourth plot because of the viability stuff. And as Peter says, unlike something where there's housing involved, we can't demand, as I understand it, of what Gary was saying anyway, we can't demand further details. So this is a really difficult, unsatisfactory situation to be in for a lot of us, I think, really. So I'm just having a moan about it. There we are. I'll shut up now.
Joel?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, obviously, there's been a lot of focus on the negatives, and I don't suppose any application is going to come before us that doesn't have negatives. Otherwise, a lot of these things would just go through. And I also don't feel, whilst, you know, I prefer blue than red, shall we say, I don't think I can make a decision based on the colours of the buildings or even the height. And that was really the only objection that Historic England had, was to bring the height down slightly. I think the benefits over previous applications that have come forward, you know, the benefits of the regeneration of that area, what it might do to St Nick's Market, even the fact that they may well be empty office blocks, but they'll still be generating business rates and an income for a council that has lack of funds. I think there's just way too many positives and potential future negatives of other applications that might come before us. Just one thing I wanted to say on the trees, though, is that I'm in the ward where we have money to plant trees from Section 106 money, and we've got nowhere to plant them. And I don't think it's good enough to just say, you must replace trees with money. I think maybe, and this isn't for now, the council needs to do more about identifying where all of these trees will go, which will in turn make the planning process a lot simpler for us to make decisions, because we'll know they're going to be planted and not just some money in a pot for one day somebody planting something. So.
Thank you, John. I think everyone's spoken now, so we'll move to the vote. I'm going to test the mood of the meeting by moving the approval subject to the planning agreement, and if we also add the advice note to the area committee to look at investment in Castle Park. So I'll move that. Is there a seconder, Chris? Thank you. Can I put that to the vote? I'll do a name vote as normally. John? Andrew?
Against.
Tom?
Against.
Fee?
For.
Ed?
Against.
Marley? Philippa? Chris?
4, Chair.
Thanks. So I believe that's passed on that basis, so I declare that passed, of course. Thank you for your attendance. I think this is an important historic site, so I do think it deserved the time we gave it, but I echo your sentiments to the officers. Thank you for your efforts. Can I therefore just refer you to the next meeting, which I see is blank on the agenda I've got, but it's the 2nd of February next year at 6 p.m. And with that, can I wish you all a happy Christmas and a happy New Year?
Same to you, Chair.